I'm Lisa McLean Vanderpool with EPA. I think I know most of you. Maybe there are one or two new faces tonight. Let me just go through a few ground rules or meeting reminders. Everyone remember to mute your phones or your computers. And I believe everyone is muted.
Unless you're talking.
Right, of course, unless you're talking. And if you're on the phone and your phone does not have a mute button itself, you press *6 to mute and *6 to unmute. Also, please remember to introduce yourself before speaking so that we know who you are. And when you, let's see, if you'd like to ask a question, you don't want to interrupt, you can always send a chat at the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, and Janine will be tracking those to make sure if you want to just ask your question there, if you don't want to say it yourself, or just let her know that you want to say something so we can find the right time for that. I'll also remind folks to let the presenters present first, and we'll take questions and we'll have a discussion after that, but please let the presenters go through their presentation first. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can always, and you can't communicate, you can text Janine at 303-921-2208. And before we start, I'd like to, actually at Bonnie's request, quickly go through name and affiliation for the whole group. Although, Bonnie, I think we know everyone here, perhaps maybe just Anita and Sarah Peters could introduce themselves. Otherwise, we have all recognizable participants. Was that okay, Bonnie?
That's great with me, thank you.
Okay.
And then, Lisa, this is Linda. So we have a new person, Dan Griffins. So I wanted to welcome him, and I don't know if Steve Richtel or Dave Wilmoth want to introduce him, as he'll be working on the site coming up in the future.
Oh, great. So Dan as well. So why don't we start with Anita? Not to put you on the spot. You're muted. You need
Sorry,
to
Anita, you're muted.
I am just a concerned neighbor. I live in Murphy Creek, and I just wanted to see what was happening. I've kind of been out of touch with what's going on, so.
Well, great.
That's
Thank you for
all.
joining. That's great. And let's see, Sarah?
Hi, thank you, Lisa. I'm Sarah Peters. I'm with McGinnis and Associates as well.
Okay. And then Dan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Griffiths. I'm a geologist with Parsons.
Okay.
And understating his role. Mr. Shangra has informed us of his intent to retire at the end of the next year, and we are bringing Dan on as Tim's replacement. He's overlapping for quite a while since there's such a learning curve.
Great. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you.
Anita and Sarah. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Linda Kiefer to run through a few site updates.
And here, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So let's see. Welcome, everyone. And I hope you're enjoying the fall colors happening up in the mountains. I was up there last Friday, and there certainly were a lot of people up there looking at the pretty trees changing colors. So I'm going to give a few site updates. So as we know, venture to find a facilitator has not been fruitful yet. EPA's contracting is looking to have that contract awarded by September 30th with the hopes of having a facilitator in the upcoming months. However, as we get to the end of the fiscal year, nothing's completely guaranteed. So hopefully it will get awarded by September 30th. As I mentioned before in the past, EPA, through our contractors, Tetra Tech, PWT, and then in conjunction with the WSD's contractor, CDM, have put together a conceptual site model. It's very large, and so we're still reviewing it within the agencies and finalizing some figures for that. So it isn't ready for the public review period. Hopefully that will be in late October or November. And starting back way before last October, the group has been working on the North End investigation report and then the corresponding risk assessment that goes with that. Those were finalized on September 2nd. And they were put on the EPA website. So if you don't have a copy, you can look there, or you can email Lisa and we'll send you a link to those reports. Along with the risk assessment, the City of Aurora's Planning and Economic Development Committee has a proposed ordinance under consideration regarding putting restrictions on a quarter-mile section of land north of Yale. And then also just west of Gun Club to west of Harvest. At the committee's request, Dr. David Berry, our toxicologist from EPA, gave a presentation on the risk assessment for the North End on September 9th to that committee. And then lastly, we did receive the McGinnis and Associates surface water data review on August 18th. EPA is currently reviewing it, and we are hoping to have a response back out very shortly. Just a couple more reviews internally before we can put that out, and we'll email that out to the group. And those were all the updates I had. Any questions?
Okay, and let's go over to Bonnie Rader for some CAG updates.
Okay, we were kind of amazed after the CAG did comment on the risk assessment because the CAG did not know that the risk assessment was supposed to be a final document. However, I felt that it was important that we understand we've had rumors and we've heard rumors of rumors. And so we felt it was important that we talk to you about the TAG grant, and don't we have some sort of a budget, and how can we do this? So we thought we'd give you a little explanation here and be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Dietrich McGinnis, who is our technical advisor, is on the line as well. And so if you have questions of our technical advisor, but I want to walk through what we do and what we have done with our budget. So why has the CAG sent so much of the grant? Don't they have a budget? Yes, of course we have a budget, and we would love to be able to stick to our budget. In all of our various jobs and obligations that all of you work with in your agencies, would it be easy to meet your budget when you're not given the proper documents or plans to accomplish the proposed work? How can you stick to a budget under these conditions? Also, if the working environment does not allow for a cooperative effort with everyone working toward the same goal, where does that leave the budget? The goal of the CAG and the WSDs and EPA are at totally opposite ends of the spectrum. The 2005 consent decree was signed between the settling defendants, the trust, and EPA. State of Colorado was not a signator. On page 8 of the CD states, the parties recognize and the court, by entering this CD, finds that this CD has been negotiated by parties in good faith, that implementation of the CD will expedite the cleanup of the site and will avoid prolonged and complicated litigation between the parties, and that this CD is fair, reasonable, and in the public interest. This CD was filed November 17th, 2005. It is now 2020, and there has been no cleanup of the site. The CD has not performed in the best interest of the public. It appears to the CAG the CD requires that the goal of the WSDs and EPA is to maintain the status quo and protect the trust when this 2005 document was signed. Whereas the goal of the CAG is to search for technically sound information and solutions to the threat of more than 138 million gallons of chemical waste traveling in the groundwater into our neighborhoods, and the possibility of the mass of uncontained chemicals breaching and destroying the Denver aquifer and possibly the Arapahoe aquifer. How much further apart could our goals be? At the end of 2019, the Lowry Landfill CAG, along with EPA and CDBHE, provided comments regarding the October 16, 2019 document entitled Updated 1,4-Dioxane Plume Map and North End Conceptual Model, 2017 5-Year Review, issue number 6, Lowry Landfill Site. Both agencies and the CAG group had substantial comments over 26 pages for just the CAG group after numerous conference calls and meetings. Managing the document from the RPs, responsible parties, with its numerous errors that directly affected the management of risk from the site was a costly and time-consuming endeavor by our technical advisors. The effort and comments by the CAG group were consistent and likely a less costly effort than those of the agencies, but with one important difference. A single document review can be a significant portion of the CAG budget. The review of the North End document is typical for documents produced by the responsible parties. A consistent complaint by the CAG technical support shared with EPA in the effort and expense resulting from low quality and technically flawed documents created by the responsible parties. It's a costly impact to the CAG-TAG grant, and we are dedicated to eliminating the false information that is put out for public review. The CAG cannot sit back and accept this. The CAG-TAG can produce numerous documents to support this claim if necessary. The recent risk assessment, that was to support the North End assessment by EPA that all is safe for the public, is an example of how the TAG grant funds are used to expose incomplete and inaccurate information when determining the health and safety of the community. This collaborative cooperation between EPA and CDBHE was supported by EPA as an enforcement document, which it is not. The CAG-TAG has been threatened with losing their funding for commenting on a document the EPA had already approved. This is not an enforcement document. We did not comment on something that had already been approved. The final conclusions are the TAG grant is depleted due to the efforts of the community members to assure that information that is not accurate is not distributed to the community. This can only be accomplished by using scientifically technical experts to investigate and divine the technical information. The EPA and WSDs, while ignoring the existing rules and regulations, it should be defining the work done at the Lowry landfill site. For instance, the record of decision. The containment components of the groundwater remedy shall meet the performance standards which are presented in the various tables and includes all ARARs for the selected remedy, including the groundwater portion of the remedy. Table 11-2 presents chemical-specific numeric standards for groundwater remedy, some which are based on ARARs. Table 11-2 performance standards shall be met at the groundwater compliance boundary. Folks, this does not mean Yale. It does not mean Jewel, does not mean Mississippi. The remedy is defined in the record of decision for the Lowry landfill site and its completion of the 5-year performance review, which confirms that the remedy is in conformity at the compliance boundary. EPA and the WSDs are not presenting work plans, data, or accurate information on the Lowry landfill Superfund site, and this is the cause that the grant money has been spent because we've had to dispute their conclusions. In other words, the CAG tag is doing the work that the CAG tag believes EPA should be doing. The goal of the CAG is to verify and authenticate the information provided by the WSDs and which has been approved by the EPA to assist the impacted residents in making decisions in the best interest of protecting public health and the environment. We may be forced to spend our funds too quickly, but if Waste Management and EPA would begin to cooperate in finding a solution to how to control the mass at the landfill and to protect the state's waters and public health, the funds would be more appropriately spent. So this is in response to all the rumors and the rumors of rumors that we have heard about, doesn't the CAG have a budget, and why doesn't it stick to its budget?
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Did anyone have any questions for Bonnie? Okay.
Bonnie, did you put that in a document so that it can be reviewed by those of us that have a little bit of a lag in following it?
I can do that for you. I put it together this afternoon after I heard comments from the rest of the group. Some of the group has been out of town, and so I'll be happy to share that in a finalized version.
Well, I appreciate that because I mean, I did follow your commentary, but I'd like to have it for review.
I'll be happy to share it.
Thank you.
I would just like to make a comment, if I may. Bonnie, I want to thank you so much for putting that together because our money is precious to us. And I think people need to understand why it's being spent so quickly. And hopefully this will prompt all the agency folks to present their work in a little different way and to have accurate information going forward so that we're not constantly spending money correcting the information that they're presenting to the public. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, and in an effort to stay on time, I think we can move to the stormwater surface water discussion. And I'd like to hand it over to Sarah Peters, I believe, for the McGinnis and Associates portion of that.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'd like to start out with this is my second participating event here with the CAG. My background is in regulatory permitting and compliance. I have a degree in environmental engineering. I wanted to start out with my understanding that what this discussion is going to look like may be a little different than previous discussions. I am slated for about 15 minutes, but I think the hope and goal is that I will get my points in and then maybe have a little discussion about those points now or following the WSD's presentation. So I think everyone had access to the questions that I sent out, or that Bonnie, I think, sent out following last month's CAG meeting. To summarize those, a couple of points, bulleted points of what we were looking for through those questions. After review of the surface water interpretations and other documents that have come off the site, I was asked to take a look at the stormwater monitoring plan for the site from 2008. And I had a couple questions related to that and how it interplays with the current operations of the site. First of all, we need a clear understanding of the interpretation of the 5-year long-term surface water monitoring program request, as it appears to be an incomplete stormwater management plan. A full stormwater management plan would include designs and schedules with reporting requirements, et cetera. And this document references other documents that have those schedules, designs, and reporting in them, which means that the document as a whole is not a stormwater management plan. It is essentially a guidance document for stormwater management at the site. We need a clear understanding of the exemption from providing a completed stormwater management plan available for review by the public, as this is in compliance with Emergency Public Right to Know Act, and is, I think, considered at every state level an important part of a stormwater management program. We need a clear understanding of stormwater sampling schedules with expectations of data quality objectives, whether are we looking at data with a hope of seeing seasonal trends or first flush data, etc. That is unclear in the document. We need a clearer understanding of stormwater sampling analytes, where they came from and why they exclude the COCs at the site. That's my summary of the questions that came out and the hopes and goals of those questions and the responses to those questions.
Okay, and I think we will switch over to Tim Shangra to present his bullets, and then after that, we'll just touch base with the EPA state and local agency response, and then open it up for the wider discussion. That's kind of the plan that Janine and Bonnie and Tom and I came up with. So Tim, if you're ready, we could, and I think, Tim, you wanted Janine to share the screen with your presentation, is that right?
So yeah, thank you, Lisa. I might be able to just share it here because then I can use my cursor and kind of walk you through.
Oh yeah, right. Okay,
some
great.
of the issues, right? So let me give that a try first. I think this is it right there. Does that come up?
Yep.
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Okay. So according to the agenda, I think you've identified 15 minutes to walk through this. I'll try to meet that objective, but it may just give you a heads up. It may take a little bit longer. And Sarah, I would like to try to address some of your comments as well. So just an overview. I want to talk about the background of how we got to where we are with the stormwater monitoring plan. And then I'll go into the management program itself and talk about the ARARs, basically, you know, what kind of regulations are driving the program. And walk through that there are really two components to the program. One is a management plan and another one is a monitoring program. And then wrap it up with a summary slide. So maybe in setting the stage for the discussion, I just wanted to briefly talk about the difference between stormwater and surface water, because there does seem to be some misunderstanding in some of the correspondence. So just for clarity, stormwater is water in a water course that's produced from precipitation events. Could be rain, could be snow melt, but it is just precipitation events. It's not from, say, groundwater contribution to the water course, as opposed to surface water, which could be a combination of the two, as well as upstream sources. Say if you're higher up in the watershed, could be snow melt, from a glacier, whatever, like the South Platte River, say. Now there are three types of water courses that are I'd like to just put on the table here. One is intermittent water course, and that is a conveyance channel that only conveys stormwater. No groundwater is contributed to that water course. Then there's another category called ephemeral streams. Ephemerals are water courses that have groundwater contribution. In some cases, in some parts of the stream, there's groundwater contribution. In other parts, there's not. So there could be, in cases with, say, the Murphy Creek, we've got groundwater that's exposed. That's not necessarily stormwater. That's just groundwater exposed. And then the third category is perennial, and that's where we have basically stream flow all the time. So I'm going to walk through these. I'll use those definitions as I walk through the presentation. So let's go to the next bullet. The ROD, going back to the ROD and having to do with operable units 5, which are surface water and sediments. The risk assessment associated with the ROD included the surface water removal action as it was in place. Excuse me, as it was in place. It did not include the remedy associated with the tire pile area, nor did it include the extra 2 feet of cover that was put on the north face, nor did it include the slurry wall around the sides of the landfill. So with that understanding, the risk assessment looked at hypothetical future on-site residential exposure scenarios and hypothetical future off-site recreational exposure scenarios. And to kind of walk through the numbers, the upshot was that there may be an unacceptable exposure to a residential scenario where surface water is ingested by a child. But the sediment ingested as a child or sediment ingested as an adult were well within EPA's risk range. The hypothetical future offsite recreational setting, in all cases, the surface water exposure scenario, risk scenario, it involved less than 10 to the minus 6 cancer risk. And because the sediment ingestion as child or adult for the residential on site, which is the most say liberal use of the property, showed that the risk was well below EPA's criteria, it was not even performed for the recreational use offsite. So the take-home message on the ROD risk assessment was no further action was required for surface water or sediments other than groundwater monitoring. Okay. So going to the next slide then, the monitoring associated with the initial plan was called the interim compliance monitoring plan. That was prepared right after the WSDs began work on the site. So it became effective in 1996, and it continued until 2008, so for a period of about 12 years. And the objective of the ICMP was to provide a technical basis for long-term surface water / stormwater monitoring during and following remediation. And the question was, are contaminants migrating from the soils into surface water? So to address that question, 3 monitoring stations were developed. And I'll go to the next slide here. Station number 1, so this is the landfill here. It's kind of a topographic depiction of the landfill. This is the section 31 landfill up here. So section 6, actually section 6 is way down here. But surface water monitoring station number 1 was located on the western side. Surface water monitoring station number 2 is located in Unnamed Creek, near the old water treatment plant. And station number 3 is located up here at the confluence of Murphy Creek and Unnamed Creek. Okay, so you've got these 3 monitoring stations that were monitored annually for 12 years for 20 compounds of concern that were identified in the ROD. And those included VOCs, dioxin, PCB, and metals. The comparison criteria for those were the surface water standards listed in the ROD or background concentrations for metals, whichever were higher. And the result were twofold. One, all of the water that was monitored for the 12 years was determined to be stormwater. So these are intermittent water courses. And the second is that the COCs were all below performance standards except for the total aluminum. And total aluminum was only attributed to the clay content that was carried in the suspended solids. So again, the take-home message here was that there was no release of compounds of concern from the site up until the end of the interim compliance monitoring plan. So going then into the 2007 5-year review, the 5-year review said the remedy is protective of public health and the environment, even with 79 micrograms per liter dioxin in station SW3A. And again, that's the one that was up here. That was representative of groundwater exposed at the surface water. We talk about that in some of those stations in the north end evaluation report. And I want to get to that in a minute. The 5-year review recommended that the WSD should develop a long-term compliance monitoring plan for surface water. And the 2008 stormwater monitoring plan addresses that recommendation. So that's how we got to the need for and the scope of the existing stormwater monitoring plan. Now, to clarify, the 2008 stormwater monitoring plan is separate from the north end investigations. So again, the on-site monitoring plan is to address stormwater associated with the site, whereas surface water samples that were collected as north of the site were collected as part of the north end groundwater investigation. And the surface water samples there were used to assess interrelationships between groundwater and surface water. Okay, so let's go into the ARARs associated with the monitoring plan. First of all, the state of Colorado regulates stormwater under the Colorado Discharge Permit System, and the reference is cited here. And back in 2007, when this plan was prepared, there were 2 guidance documents that were available to be followed. One was what we call the stormwater guidance, and it was listed as a CDPHE guidance for stormwater discharges associated with heavy and light industrial activities. And that guidance references landfills as heavy industry. Okay, so the next is the general permit that CDPHE developed as part of the CDPS, as part of basically their permitting system. And the general permit had its own guidance document, so associated with discharges for heavy industry. Again, that's the landfill qualifies as heavy industry. So the guidance document for preparing the management requirements and the monitoring requirements came from the general permit. So I kind of jumped to the next slide here. The certification for the general permit was to prepare, in order to qualify for the general permit, you had to prepare and implement a stormwater management plan. So that's what we did. Now, Sarah, you raised a question about no exposure certification. So as part of the general permit, there's a provision within the general, there's a provision that allows no exposure certification if the permitted facility has basically no exposure of their materials to stormwater. So when we look at, and this is a reference for that. So it can be granted if a landfill has a stabilized final cover, that the facilities like a water treatment plant or an office are enclosed, and the outside facilities have secondary containment. And that is exactly what we have at Lowry. All of our external storage tanks have secondary containment. And the basis for the secondary containment is included in the various design documents, particularly for the water treatment plant. So I make a comment here that Lowry qualifies for an no exposure certification. Now, that said, in 2005, the WSDs prepared an engineering design and operations plan for the Section 6 landfill. And the intent of that plan is to allow for the burial or the placement of construction and demolition debris on top of the landfill. It doesn't involve excavating into the landfill mass. It involves placing it on top of the landfill. So because that activity would present some disturbance, the WSDs concluded that it would be in everybody's best interest to proceed with preparing an SMP for the ultimate implementation of the EDOP. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so what does the plan consist of? There's two components, as I mentioned earlier. One is a stormwater management plan, and the other one is the monitoring program. Now, these are all in conformance with the general permit. So the general permit lays out the stormwater management plan requirements, and those are laid out in the plan itself, in the stormwater monitoring plan. And we list those, we bullet list those in the plan. We went back and looked at the existing plans that addressed covers and stormwater monitoring, water treatment, contingency planning, extraction of groundwater from the various groundwater extraction systems, and management of on-site waste, as well as the Section 6 EDOP. And we concluded that those plans adequately cover the substantive requirements of the requirements under stormwater management plan from the general permit. So by reference, those are included as part of the stormwater monitoring plan. The requirements also cite you need to have a site plan. So this is included in the stormwater monitoring plan, and it lays out the drainages associated with the site and how drainage is conveyed off-site. So real quick, I'll just walk through these. So there's a main drainage that from the landfill cover that's picked up in an eastern perimeter drainage ditch, and it runs along the east side of the landfill behind the GTAP and discharges into unnamed creek right here where my cursor is. Then you've got the unnamed creek drainage that flows over the surface water removal action. Then you've got these two tributary drainages that drain the site from these directions. So all of these converge to this point, which is where the stormwater monitoring plan sampling point is located. To the west of the site, there's another drainage ditch that conveys water this way, and then it goes around the Section 31 landfill, and then ultimately to Dad's detention basin up at the north end of Section 31. And under Dad's stormwater monitoring plan, that basin is monitored and sampled. So the only component of the site that doesn't necessarily have a monitoring point would be this little teeny corner down here. And there's this little teeny drainage that basically runs underneath Gun Club Road. And we say in the plan that the monitoring, the water quality that we're monitoring at this point should be representative of the water quality that would be coming off of this point. Because again, all of this area is covered by a 4 to 6 foot clay cover. And EPA accepted that assumption. Okay, so those are the components. Those address the components of the stormwater management plan. Now, the next component is the monitoring program. Again, under the general permit, this citation part 1D2B requires annual monitoring without a stabilized cover. So again, even with a stabilized cover, we're proceeding with implementing this plan and collecting annual samples from that one stormwater monitoring location. The parameters that are required under the general permit are oil and grease, pH, COD, and TSS. And then the documentation for collection of the samples are provided here. And we report this information in our SSRs. We report this information in our semi-annual status reports. And as far as the, if you've noticed, we report the water quality results and as well the precipitation event, the precipitation amount, and we calculate what the flow was at the time of sampling at that monitoring point by estimating the saturated of the wetted perimeter and the cross-sectional area of the storm flow times the stream flow measured or observed at the time of sampling, which is typically about 1 foot per second. So area times velocity equals CFF equals discharge in terms of cubic feet per second. And that's, we're typically in the just barely 1 CFS. And so we're not, even during some high precipitation events, we have not been seeing much storm flow leave the site. So in summary, the ROD risk assessment indicated that the risk associated with surface water and sediments was within the acceptable range with no further action required other than monitoring. The ICMP from 1996 was in place for 12 years, and it provided a very good database for that could be used or applied to developing a long-term stormwater monitoring plan. And that was performed. In 2007, the 2007 5-year review concluded that the remedy was protective even with a 79 microgram per liter dioxane at surface water station 3A in 2006, and recommended updating the stormwater monitoring plan, which we did. And then the stormwater monitoring plan of 2008 has been in effect since it was prepared, follows CDPHE guidance, and we're implementing the plan even though the Section 6 EDOP has not yet begun. And then finally, annual monitoring results are reported in the semi-annual O&M status reports. So that's my presentation. There any other questions? I guess we can address those at a later time.
Great. I think we'll go straight to anyone from EPA or CDPHE or local government representatives who wish to make any kind of statement in response to this before we open it up to the larger discussion. And Tim, you can stop sharing your screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, here we go. Sorry.
Okay, the state and local and EPA agencies will probably respond during the larger discussion. So we can just open it up to questions now and comments.
If you don't mind it, I've got some follow-up questions. This is Sarah Peters. I don't know how formally you want us to introduce ourselves as we start speaking. But I wanted to ask CDPHE about this confluence of stormwater and surface water, and if Colorado has addressed conjunctive management of surface and groundwater in their regulations.
I think it's, okay, this is Colleen Bresnahan with the Colorado Department of Health, and I'll try to address your questions But before I do that, I want to kind of set a little bit of a framework of how the regulations work in Colorado. So Tim's presentation, he was talking about Regulation 61, which is the regulation that addresses discharges into surface water bodies. So that's how the state regulates impacts from stormwater into a surface water body, is through Regulation 61. And then the surface water bodies then fall under other regulations as well. There's Regulation 31, which sets the basic standards for surface water bodies. And then the state breaks down the surface water throughout the state into basins. And then there are basin-specific regulations that are applied. And then within those basins, we have stream segments. So for this area, we're in the South Platte River Basin, and we are in stream section 16C. The Murphy Creek is in 16C. And so how the basic standards are applied to this area are based on Regulation 38, which sets up the standards for this area, and whether or not there's a discharge into a water of the state is regulated by Regulation 61. So hopefully that all makes sense. So we sort of have to look at all three of those regulations when we look at what's going on at a particular site to determine if there's a compliance issue. And at this site, as Tim presented, because it's a closed landfill, typically the only thing that is required under Regulation 61 is stormwater itself. Granted, there's a groundwater component here, and that's sort of a separate issue. So under Regulation 61, from the standpoint of a discharge from the landfill itself into the surface water body, that would fall under Regulation 61. And then they're looking at a couple of things. Because it's covered, they typically would not be requiring monitoring of site-specific contaminants because there's that soil cover in between. So the parameters that were shown in Tim's presentation are consistent with what is required at a site that has the waste separate from the stormwater flow. So the TOC and all of that, that's consistent. As far as site-specific contaminants, those are only added if those are open and exposed to surface water. So hopefully that answers at least part of your question.
Well, that clarifies some of it. However, I do want to point out that in your regulations, landfill wastewater also includes contaminated groundwater, and that is specified in your regulations as something that would be an exposure at the site. And I think that is what I'm trying to get at with the stormwater versus surface water and groundwater management component is once that stormwater enters the site and intermingles with the sediments and the potential surface water expressions of groundwater, how does the ARAR regulator, the CDPHE, how do you guys address that issue on the site? And would this site be considered currently in compliance with that?
Okay, so that's a good question. And so the way that the state usually deals with groundwater impacting surface water is really more through a seep type of discharge. So we would look at the discharge from groundwater into the surface water body to see if it's resulting in an exceedance of the surface water standard. And that's where I kind of have to walk you back to the basin specific standards. So for this area, Murphy Creek, or it's actually South Platte segment 16C, is designated uses are agricultural, aquatic life, and recreation. And those uses do not have a 1,4-dioxane standard associated with them. The only use designation in Colorado with a standard for 1,4-dioxane is water supply, and that is not a use that has been designated for this area. So there is no exceedance of 1,4-dioxane in the surface water in this area because there is no standard that applies to the surface water in this segment. If there were VOCs in surface water that exceeded the surface water standard for that segment, then we would have, then there would be some regulation of that. Because this is a surplus site, it wouldn't be a formal permit, but we would address it under the ARARs and would have to be taking steps to ensure that we're removing impacts to surface water And we do that on a lot of our sites that have surface water impacts. So the groundwater is really handled through the discharge from the groundwater into the surface water, which is very separate than the discharge from the surface water or from the storm water into the surface water. They're really handled in two separate ways within the discharge regulations. Hopefully that's not too confusing.
Well, I mean, it is, because once water enters the system, it becomes a part of the system, but that's a broader conversation. One of the areas that I was hoping to address was that idea of conjunctive management of the ground and surface water. And so when we see, and Murphy Creek's a great example of this, right? The recharge to the groundwater systems typically through surface water, right? And in this area, maybe that's incorrect, but you guys will have a better handle on that than I do. But if we're seeing exceedances of 1,5 or 1,4-dioxane in the surface water, and it's recharging the groundwater that is then used as drinking water supply for that region, wouldn't there be a conjunctive management issue with the surface water component?
Well, and see, that's the point I was trying to make. There is no water supply, no drinking water use designation for this area. So there is no exceedance of 1,4-dioxane in the surface water body.
But the
surface
5-year
water
review identified 4 private and municipal wells located within the Murphy Creek drainage.
Well, hang on. The water supply use designation is based on whether or not people are drinking water that is directly connected to that surface water body, or that surface water body supplies a drinking water source like a reservoir. So you can have a well that is from a distance very close to a surface water body, but it may be completed in a different water bearing zone. And so unless it's drawing directly from that same alluvial aquifer that the surface water body is in contact with, our water quality control division would not put a water supply use designation on that segment. And so this segment does not have a water supply use designation on it. So there is no standard for 1,4-dioxane that applies to this segment. So that's where we are. So from the standpoint of the existing standards that are applied to this segment, there is no standard for 1,4-dioxane that applies.
Thank you. That clarifies some of the management of the site. I do think that conjunctive management issue is of interest to the community at large because of how the groundwater aquifers are recharged in the area. I wanted to, Tim, address some of the slides and some and ask some clarifying questions. And I'm going to just kind of go through them if we can. My first question starts on slide 6, and where you're talking about, sorry, I'm going to bring it up real quick. So
yeah, I'll bring it up.
Thanks. So when we talk about stormwater permitting on the site and the identification of the contaminant exclusion, the exposure certification. When I was reading the regulations, the exposure certification, no exposure certification is only really applicable to sites that are completely closed. And in this case, when we talk about the monitoring plan being separate from the North End investigation, I think that the reference to a no exposure certification is kind of misleading. Because that monitoring plan on every project that I've worked on with stormwater monitoring really has to include all areas where contaminants may occur. And when we're talking about stormwater intermingling with surface water expressions of groundwater that may be contaminated, there is a question of, is this plan extended to those locations, or is there is that a piece of the site that we have to address separately?
I think you asked about 5 questions there. I'll see if I can unpackage that. First of all, the statement that the landfill is closed, or that the facilities are closed so that there's no exposure, is appropriate for a closed landfill. We've got 4 to 6 feet of clay cover over the landfill. And then wherever we have facilities that could generate hazardous material, those facilities are closed or enclosed with a building. They have secondary containment within the building, and there's also secondary containment associated with the external storage tanks. So we don't have a mechanism for stormwater to commingle with a waste source. So by definition, it's enclosed, or there's no exposure. The second part, from what I heard you say, would be that, well, what happens if contaminated groundwater intermingles with stormwater? Well, on the site, we don't have that condition. The groundwater table is always below the base of the surface drainages. So there's not a mechanism for that to happen either. So we look at the bigger picture, like I think you were doing, and kind of look at it from like a 10,000 foot level and say, where is the exposure risk for stormwater that would enter the site to become contaminated and then leave the site and and transport contaminant mass downstream? And we don't see it.
So stormwater is not a contributor to groundwater in the region at all?
It probably is. It probably recharges groundwater, but stormwater is clean. Stormwater, like we said,
Stormwater runoff from the site is clean.
Right. It's just runoff. It may have suspended solids, and it might have oil and grease because there's going to be, trucks running around. But those aren't really COCs of in groundwater.
I think that is a good place to ask about the scheduling and the data quality objectives of this annual stormwater sampling event. And I actually had a question about that regulatorily, and CDPHE may be able to answer this part. In the regulations I was reading related to the general permit, it requires quarterly sampling now. So I'm wondering if the annual sampling is a historic kind of relic from the 2008 general permit that this was designed for. But let's talk about DQOs first.
Is that a question for Colleen, or is that a question for me?
Well, Tim, I wanted to ask you, what are the data quality objectives at that stormwater sampling point, and how do you use those data for the site, for assessing the site?
So it's a good question. The DQOs are complying with the general permit requirements, and there are no comparison criteria for those parameters that are being sampled. And Colleen, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just a matter of.
You're right. You are correct. That is generally the case for any of these sites that are monitoring those same constituents. There's not a specific criteria. They're looking for trends and that kind of thing. Yeah. And then they use best management practices to try to reduce concentrations of concern that they're seeing, but there's no specific parameters that are used to determine whether there's a compliance issue or not.
Yeah.
So Colleen, do you require that the annual sample occur at a specific time of year or for a specific sample of the stormwater? And I can think of oil, right? The first flush of stormwater is going to mobilize the oil on the surface of anything. And so if we're not catching that and then taking a sample later down the road, then that annual buildup of oil will not be observed in that sample. So
You know, those decisions are often made on a very site-specific basis, so I'm not really in a position to give a general answer to that. And just to kind of let you know, I'm not in the water quality control division, so when they're actually reviewing permits on non-CERCLA sites, you know, I'm not involved in that process. So I certainly have had sites where I've been the project manager from a remediation standpoint. We've had some surface water permits or stormwater monitoring programs. So I'm aware of how they apply the regulations, but I am not the expert on the regulations. So I just want to make that clear. So if there are maybe some of your questions I can't directly answer without consulting with the Water Quality Control Division folks themselves. And that's actually one of them. So, you know, I don't know if quarterly monitoring is always required, and I'm not necessarily sure how they apply the timing of the sampling. It's typically a storm event. It has to be a significant storm event, and they've identified the location. But Tim might be able to provide some insight.
I wanted to maybe take that a step further. It's dry out there, and it's very rare that we even have flow to sample. So it's, you know, it's one of those things, Sarah, where when it rains, it really rains, but 99% of the time it doesn't rain. So it's, you know, when we can collect a sample, when the automatic sampler has enough water to trigger, it samples. And that's, you know, sometimes we'll go a year without having enough flow to be able to sample.
It's good to know that it's an automatic sampler, because that is
it's an ISCO sampler, and we set it up, you know, in the springtime, and you know, that's how we sample it.
And does it take first flush then? Is that the idea? It automatically starts to collect when it hits a certain.
It collects when there's, I think, 1 inch, when there's a certain limit of water in the reach, then it'll activate. But yeah, more or less, it's going to be the first flush.
Yeah. No, that's good to know. That's good to know. It's interesting that that's not something that's quantified in this management plan. I would think EPA would want to keep those things, particularly because they're doing other surface water monitoring on the site, keep those pretty consistent for data use. I saw in the chat that there was another question. If you want to move on, I've got other questions, but I don't want to take up all the time.
Sure. Well, you know, we're in the various local government portion of the meeting, and we do have a comment from Jan Yeckes, who's with Arapahoe County. The person who would be able to respond to this presentation and this discussion is Lisa Knurr, and she's out of the office. But Jen will relay the question and the content of this discussion to her after her return, and see whether she'd like to email comments at a later point. Okay, just letting the CAG know that. Also, Sonia has a question for CDPHE. Sonia? Be sure and unmute.
Sorry. Thank you. Yes, this was addressed, I think, twice already by CDPHE, but I'm not sure that I understood the answer, so I'd like to ask it again. So from what I understood, when the category of use is agricultural, aquatic life, and recreational use, there is no standard whatsoever for 1,4-dioxane. Is that correct? So it could be.
Yes, in surface water, that is correct. In that particular surface water segment, there is no standard for 1,4-dioxane that applies to that segment.
Can you just explain just real briefly what the thinking is there? I mean, even if there were massive quantities, it would not be regulated. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, it's the Water Quality Control Commission and the division that set those standards. And so what they look at are the uses of the stream segment and potential exposures to those uses. So for aquatic life, it's obviously fish and that sort of thing. And they're looking at whether there's toxicity of a particular chemical to aquatic life. For recreational, it's going to be, you know, folks, you know, fishing or, you know, just playing in the stream or whatever. And then there's agricultural, which is obviously crops and potential livestock. And so based on, and they look at these at least every 3 years, and they look at the toxicity information for each chemical that they regulate. And based on their evaluations, and it's a different staff than us, it's Water Quality Control Division is a different division. And they set the use standards or the numerical standards for those uses based on the most recent toxicity information and exposure scenarios for those targets. And so those are set in Regulation 31, which are the general surface water standards, and those include the numeric standards. So the only use that there is a 1,4-dioxane standard for surface water is if that surface water is used as water supply. And that basically is drinking water. So based on the reviews the Water Quality Control Division has done, they are only regulating 1,4-dioxane if it's used for drinking water, which is why we have a groundwater standard for 1,4-dioxane. And in surface water bodies that are used for water supply, it's the same standard as is in the groundwater. So because this segment does not have a water supply use designation, the water supply standard doesn't apply to this segment.
So, just in follow-up, at the last meeting, information was presented regarding dermal exposure, which the state has standards for, but those are not incorporated in this, in the water quality regulations. How does that interact?
I believe it is included in theirs, and again, I don't work directly for the Water Quality Control Division, so I can't really speak to everything they evaluate as part of their process, but they go through a very specific process every time they look at a stream segment, and they do look at these about every 3 years. So unfortunately, I'm not the best person to tell you this, you know, how they look at everything, but there is a process they go through, and they work with EPA's water quality folks, and there's a very set process under the Clean Water Act that they go through to evaluate the uses and what are the appropriate standards that apply to those uses. And so the division that Dustin and I work in, we then apply those standards. We're not the ones that come up with those standards. So I can certainly get some more information from them and provide a follow-up if you'd like to get a little bit more information on how they come up with those standards and what they're looking at when they come up with those standards.
Very much so, thank you. And if you could, again, square that with the requirements for dermal exposure that the toxicologist was discussing and so on. Those came from somewhere, and they should coordinate with the water quality regulations that govern, you know, dermal exposure for recreation.
Well, if you're talking about the risk assessment, those actually came from the toxicologists we work with.
Right.
And so, and I'm sure that they do look for the recreational use, they would look at dermal exposure. My assumption would be that they have found that the risks in a recreational use scenario don't fall within the range that they would put a specific standard associated with it on that surface water body. So, but again, I can follow up and see if I can get some information on the specific things that they look at when they set a standard.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Bonnie Rader has her hand up. Bonnie?
Put it down and all.
Okay, I have, because we're talking about the North End and Murphy Creek, my question or my suggestion is that in the 5-year review, 2017 5-year review, page 34 on institutional controls, it states that the 1,4-dioxane plume extends off-site to the north. No institutional controls are in place in this area, and there are private wells located within the footprint in the vicinity of the plume. In addition, there are domestic drinking water wells located approximately 1,000 feet east of the leading edge of the plume just outside Murphy Creek drainage in Gun Club Estates. The recommendation in the 5-year review is develop an updated plume map, conceptual site model to ensure that there is no potential for future exposure in this area. Based on the results, evaluate the need for monitoring plan for wells located within the vicinity of the plume edge. Also assess the need for additional institutional controls for the 1,4-dioxane plume area. I'm very interested to know if this step is going to be addressed by EPA and the WSDs. I think institutional controls in this area are very important. And so with that thought in mind, I would also say I think that the institutional control discussion is more important than the risk assessment and determining safety here. And I would hope that the city of Aurora would consider requesting this activity from the WSDs because it is their responsibility. So I hope we can get some support for that. It is a suggestion in the 5-year review. Secondly, according to, I have to state that we're still concerned about the 0.9 PQL that the WSDs and EPA are approving. And the reason we're very concerned about it is that Richard, my husband, has been doing a lot of research on some of the construction sites around us and trying to get caught up on whether or not they're following the requirements that you do water testing when you get down into the groundwater, and Richard can elaborate on this a bit more. But we were totally shocked, and maybe Colleen, I hate to put you on the spot here, but we were totally shocked when Richard contacted the water quality control people, the people that approve permits and so on, and Richard has emails in which they said this, but the number they're using at some of these sites is 0.9. And the reason that they're using 0.9 for the 1,4-dioxane is because EPA has approved 0.9 for the Lowry Landfill Superfund site. And so they don't think there's a law in Colorado or in the IRIS database or at EPA that says 0.35 is Colorado's number. And so we're confused how Buckley and other sites are going for 0.35, and that's what EPA is requiring, and they're determined to clean up that level. But at Lowry, using 0.9, and then on top of it, because a Superfund site is using it, we're shocked that the water quality control people who write the permits and approve everything are saying 0.9 is okay. So, you know, we need to figure something out here on what is or isn't the rule.
So I have a follow-up question for you on that, Bonnie. Is this a stormwater discharge or a dewatering permit? Is that the permit that you're referring to from water quality? So it's going from.
I'll let Richard answer you. Okay. He's got all those emails of response.
Okay, thank you.
So this is Linda Kiefer. There was a lot in that statement that you made, Bonnie. I do want to address the institutional control question that you had. That 2017 5-year review neglected to identify, I'm going to put it up on my screen, that the city of Aurora has restrictions and prohibitions on putting into wells in the city of Aurora unless expressly approved by the water quality manager. So all the people in the city of Aurora to that north of, we're in the residential area along Murphy Creek, are on municipal water. The sections of that area that are unincorporated Arapahoe County do have a couple private wells along Jewel. Those are sampled every year for 1,4-dioxane for over a decade and have not, that 1,4-dioxane has not been found in those wells. The other wells that are in or adjacent to the footprint of the plume that are in unincorporated Arapahoe County have been inspected by Tri-County Health. I went out there myself and inspected them. They're abandoned, and then that is documented in 2 recent memorandums, one from June 3rd, 2020, and the other's June 1st, 2020. And those are available on EPA's website. So we are, confident that people are not drinking water that has 1,4-dioxane in it from the plume from Lowry landfill.
In what area?
Well, the wells along Jewel, and then there's different wells that were in the footprint that were abandoned. And then you have all the people on municipal water in the Murphy Creek subdivision.
And then you have Gun Club Estates, which is 1,000 feet from the plume and more because going on north, you've never tested. So I appreciate your thoughts here, Linda. And I know that the Pingle well down on Highway 30 in Jewel and the Reed well, they're both 600 feet deep. And I know they've been tested all these years. There's never been any results from that testing that we have been given. The same as I did not have any idea, and maybe somebody else on the CAG did, that this survey in the area, the EPA went out there and looked at them and decided that they were safe. I understand what you're saying, and I would like a little more documentation. And I'd also like to know if the Pingle and Reed well, we know they're 600 feet deep, so we don't expect things to be there yet, but it's good that we're testing it because you never can tell in this geology out here with so many sand lenses that it may not slip through. So we're just saying that we think the CAG is of the opinion that institutional controls, other than saying you can't drill a well here, are an important factor, and we'd like to have that discussion a little further. And I will talk to the city of Aurora about that and make the suggestion, and of course it's their decision in the end. But we think it's an important item that it still needs to be followed up on. So I appreciate your information, and I do know that you're accurate about the Pingle and Reed well, but they are deep wells and we're talking about shallower wells. So I'd like something in writing, and you say I can get it on the website. That's one of the issues that we have here, is that what happened to the ROD requirement that the EPA maintain a system down at EPA and one at the city of Aurora where people can go and do research and look up documents. I can't, I can't find things anymore. And the last time I went to EPA for record search, they said they were going to charge me $400 and that I couldn't come down to EPA anymore to do a research. So what's happening with the record center?
So right now we're under COVID and no information repository in the nation for EPA is open for the public. If there are documents that you can't find or need, certainly email Lisa and we can get those for you. I've been keeping.
Linda, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I made this request 3 years ago and nobody could help me. And they said the record center wasn't open and that they were going to have to charge me $400 for 10 documents. And so this was before COVID. That's not an excuse now.
So I can't speak to what happened 3 years ago. We do have a FOIA process. Yes, that does exist. But we are happy to, we put these documents up when they become final, just as we did with the North End investigation. These June documents are up there. So we can, if you're missing something, we'd be happy to get that to you.
So is
So
the
they will
EPA
make-
Records Center going to be available?
Within this world of COVID, I cannot answer that question. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We're not allowed in our building right now. So
Okay, we'll let it go. Thank you.
So just a point of clarification, the SSRs contain the results of the Reed and Ning wells, sampling wells, and they have been for the last 10 years.
Or
So
when?
that information is public information. I think McGinnis is CC'd on those SSRs. They're in the database. So they're there.
Good, Tim. So now tell me this, it's not like we don't have a lot to look at, correct? So tell me this, in all of your work, what specifically, is it more than 1,4-dioxane that's been tested for in those wells? Before this last series, before this last test?
We recently sampled for, I think, VOCs 2018.
Yes, and before that?
We didn't need to.
Okay.
Only
because
1,4-dioxane is what we sampled for.
I know, but the community asked you to sample for volatiles.
EPA did not ask us to sample for volatiles.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay, so for those who don't follow all the acronyms, SSR is the semi-annual status report. And I believe we just, Dustin just sent around notification. We have posted those to our records managers. So, and you have the links in your emails.
Okay, and I interrupted Richard, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're on mute.
Are you unmuted? Richard?
Can't hear you, Richard.
Can't hear you, sir.
How about now?
Sorry, Richard, you're still muted.
I think he gave up. I'm sorry, sir. Dietrich, you had something? Maybe Richard can figure out his technical issue while Dietrich is talking.
Sure, and happy to have him jump in. I was happy to see you got the quote from the 2007, this is for Tim, 2007 5-year review regarding, and I think it was actually specific to surface water. The response was the stormwater plan. Was there any direction at all to increase monitoring of surface water downstream to kind of a lot of the discussion in that 5-year review was about discharge of shallow groundwater that contained 1,4-dioxane to Murphy Creek. And that would be downstream of the area you discussed in your presentation.
Yeah, so the downstream area was covered under the North End investigation, whereas the stormwater monitoring requirement for the site was based on the results of the ICMP. And
so was it just, but no monitoring program? There was 2 events in, I think, 2006 and 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Whereas 2006, so it'd be 1 sampling event after that 5-year review.
2. We had 2015 and 2016.
Oh, okay. But no consistent monitoring in that area then, just those two snapshots.
That is correct.
Okay. So that wasn't the intent of that comment, was not to put in a monitoring program? That was kind of confusing when we reviewed it for our white paper, because it appeared that the intent was a monitoring program because 1,4-dioxane was being found in the area and it found in surface water.
I'm not sure which comment you're referring to.
It just kind of always made me wonder.
Can you clarify on what comment you're referring to?
And Linda could maybe able to address this comment better. Within that 5-year review, it discussed the presence of 1,4-dioxane in surface water. And this was a discussion of what was occurring beyond the stormwater event. To separate stormwater, what we'd expect to run off in a storm event from the site, to surface water, which can include that, as well as recharge from the shallow aquifer. And in this case, recharge from the shallow aquifer near the site that contained 1,4-dioxane. Reading through that 5-year review and their recommendations and comments, it sounded like they were recommending a monitoring program for surface water that would encompass, say, like the result, the 79 micrograms per liter that was found at at the sample location 3. But it didn't occur. And that was something that was just never really clear. And I don't know, Linda, if this is something you can answer, why the result of those comments was a stormwater plan and not a surface water monitoring plan.
So you're talking about 2007, the 5-year review?
Yeah, I can address that, Linda.
Okay.
So it was really clear in this 2007 review that the results from the ICMP were to be rolled into a long-term surface water, stormwater, whatever you wanted to call it at the time, monitoring plan. So then when we went back and looked at what the definition of stormwater versus surface water is, we said, this is not surface water because it is just stormwater as a result of a direct precipitation. And that was a consistent finding in all of the monitoring stations for 12 years. So that goes into the category of historic information. So we had the historic information associated with stormwater. We had the historic information associated with groundwater levels. So we knew that the groundwater levels weren't above the base of the water courses. And we had the water quality historical data. So based on the collective information, we prepared a stormwater monitoring plan that was pertinent to the conditions at the site.
So that the discussion got limited to the site. Now, a lot of what we discussed in our white paper was outside the stormwater monitoring area within Murphy Creek, because really the focus is on the interaction with groundwater, surface water, particularly as this whole system approaches where we have domestic well use in the area that's in that basin. It's being recharged by this system, or through some means, whatever that may happen to be. I really appreciated Sarah Peters' discussion on conjunctive management, because I think that kind of is a good word to describe what we were looking for here. And I guess we're still kind of at a loss where the problem was identified in a 5-year review, but the response was to limit the monitoring to an area that had already been addressed, had already been capped, and not one that was even identified as being the problem, because the problem was associated with groundwater. And I'm not sure that the presentation you're giving now, maybe this is a question, are we going to get to that bigger question of what's happening downstream, where we do have the shallow aquifer discharging into Murphy Creek. We have a longer period of flow. Your own sampling shows that this is not it may be flashy, but we do have prolonged time periods of flow in there. Are we going to have that discussion about that? Is that going to be in the next meeting or the next presentation you give? Since we got the stormwater system discussed at the top, but really what our focus is downstream as we go through the homes.
So Dietrich, I'll say a few things, and this will be an EPA's response that we'll be providing in writing to you, but this is just part of it. So the 2 subsequent 5-year reviews after 2007 found the operable unit for surface water protective. So if we do not have an unacceptable risk, then we do not have issues and recommendations to do for that, for one. So it was protective for that. The recent risk assessment has shown that there is not an unacceptable risk in that area. Additionally, the irrigation water was used in that area that back in 2006 was known to have 1,4-dioxane. The concentrations are so low, it could indicate that there is some residual, but it's still well below the acceptable risk range. We have seen decreasing concentrations from 2006 to 2016 And then we also know that the source has been cut off. As Tim had mentioned, the surface water coming off the site doesn't have 1,4, it's clean, doesn't have 1,4 dioxane, so that's residual. So if Sarah Teschner or Diane McMillan want to chime in, you know, please do at this point. Let's see. But anyway, that is my response to that.
Okay, and I think the north end, I think we're looking at it a little more as a system and not trying to break it into two different things. And I think that's probably a disconnect between the discussion I'm trying to have and the answers I'm getting. I also think that the latest 5-year review did address, there were issues with the north end. And that's really what we're talking about.
Well, it was the
but maybe I could take this a step farther to something a little more concrete to follow up Bonnie's comment. What are the restrictions of putting a new well in that area? If I own property there, is there some type of restriction on my ownership that I cannot drill a well there?
So where are you talking? Aurora or unincorporated Arapahoe County?
Anywhere within a few thousand feet of what you guys are proposing as the plume right now.
Well, like I said, in Aurora, it's restricted. It can only happen with the director approving it. And then, I don't know, is Lynn Robio Wagner on the phone? She can talk about Arapahoe County. Or someone from Tri-County Health.
Yep, I'm here, Linda. The properties that are immediately to the north is City of Aurora. So City of Aurora, Linda already showed their ordinance that anybody who has a well that is annexed into City of Aurora actually gives up their water rights to be in the city. So they're the only properties to the north that are in Arapahoe County is the immediate parcels of land that are the Pingle residence is actually owned by another person named Ning, and the Reed parcel. So those are the only two Arapahoe County plots, I guess, that are, and that's why they still have their wells. If they annex into the city, for instance, if those are sold, they will then have to close their wells and close according to the state engineer's office, and they will hook on to City of Aurora water. There are other institutional controls on water use underneath the actual Lowry Superfund site. And so that water that's underneath the Superfund site, and I don't know if Steve or Dave want to add any thing to that, or Linda yourself, but there are other institutional controls that also prohibit the water use underneath the Lowry Superfund site.
Well, I'm not really too concerned about underneath the site, but I do know that for other sites I work at, we have to consider groundwater as drinking water if we do not have a specific covenant that prohibits its use. And this is particularly true, I've noticed, in Western states, which I don't think Colorado is an exception, that the access to water is very much associated with the property's worth and is considered a possible future use. Now, portions of this property are incorporated, and so we do have those restrictions from the city, but a lot of it's not. And we do have drinking water wells in the area. So I think this discussion on whether or not this is going to affect drinking water, to me, sounds like if you don't have an environmental covenant that when I buy the property, I'm signing on the dotted line, I'm not going to put a well in there, then you have to plan for a well to be put in there. And then the only restriction really to deal with then, and even then it's not a strong one, is the depth of the sanitary seal. So
okay, and
I'm not sure that that's I'm not sure how that discussion comes into this, but I think it may help focus a little bit on the groundwater connection that we keep talking about.
And Dietrich and everyone, I absolutely must respond to Lynn's information because she did not represent the city of Aurora's requirements, and nor should she. That should be Aurora Water. But I will tell you that Aurora Water would never, in an annexation agreement, ever force someone to close their well. That's not how we operate. They have the option when they are ready and infrastructure is available to come onto Aurora Water. I would like to provide some more specifics because I want to make sure that you understand that we do respect property rights and we would never force someone on Aurora Water, even when they are in the city. Lynn was correct when she said that we then own those water rights, but they get to use that well as long as it provides a safe drinking water source. So I did need to clarify that. Thank you.
And if I could just add one final thing, because I want to make sure there's time for people to ask questions. I've got a few more if it can come back around to me, but I want to think of the time. In 2010, the oil slope factor for 1,4-dioxane was amended. So I think we always need an asterisk by any risk assessment prior to then, because those safe concentrations would be lower if they were calculated today. It may not make a huge difference in your discussion, but I do think we need that little mark on what is a modern risk assessment as opposed to one prior to those factors based on a higher oil slope factor. And it's usually an order of magnitude or more in those results. So I want to leave it time for some other questions.
So Dietrich, have you looked at the 2020 risk assessment that that was finished on September 2nd? If not, I can send it.
Yeah, I think that it showed up in my email. I haven't had time to go through it, but I think when Tim Shangra was referring to the ones in the ROD.
Okay.
Right? And that was prior to 2010?
Right, arrows are frozen at the time of the ROD. That's correct.
But I'd still put an asterisk by the risk assessment because that's not the number we would calculate today.
Well,
So time could be frozen, but risk changes or risk assessment changes.
Yeah, well, read the September 2nd one and we can talk.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, Tom Kraus has some questions. Tom?
Tim Shangra is very well limited our discussion to surface water, and he's limited the surface water within the Lowry Landfill Superfund site. However, this is both supposed to be a surface water, I'm sorry, he's limited to stormwater and stormwater within Lowry Landfill Superfund site. And this is supposed to be both a stormwater and a surface water discussion. And the problem is that the surface water north of the site is contaminated. The other problem is that we keep getting referred to the North End review that hasn't been coming out yet. But we need to understand that North End review only covers through late 2018. So it's only reviewing when we still were pumping in fresh water into the ground. So that North End review is skewed by the contamination of fresh groundwater, as well as it doesn't cover anything after that, which is really important because we have we have 1,4-dioxane and other chemicals within the North End that have the potential of following the surface water and the groundwater to the north, just as the plume did. So I'd like to maybe, as Dietrich was trying to do, ask that our discussion from this point on address the surface water. And we have not been testing surface water except in 2006 and 2016, and one test of multiple ponds in 2015. That seems totally inadequate for what to represent what might be happening in that surface water. So That's my comment. Maybe somebody else can pick up from there.
I have a couple thoughts on that. Tom, I think you're totally right that looking at how the groundwater concentrations adjust and change after cessation of potable water injection leaves a big question. That's going to just take time and monitoring. So surface water quality north of the site is going to be influenced by things like precipitation runoff. And then, and we know just based on the controls at the site, the soil cover, the surface water removal action, that the site is not influencing surface water in that way. And the other way that water quality of the surface water can be impacted is through exchange from groundwater. So as in the north end, the monitoring continues in the network of wells post cessation, that provides a what we would call like a sentinel system or a red flag system for a surface water question. So as we look at that monitoring well network as it moves north of the site, if concentrations are creeping up to a point where we might see concern that if those concentrations are influencing this surface water body here, that could be impetus for sampling at that point. So you're completely right on that post-cessation monitoring and understanding the changes in the system after that point, after that cessation point, is an unknown, not the monitoring, but the monitoring is intended to fill that data gap, that unknown, into the future. And that's going to continue.
So I know we only have about 15 minutes left and only 1 minute left in this segment, but I did want to end on a note for EPA. In looking at the documentation on surface water management, particularly stormwater management, it was really difficult for myself, and I imagine for every community member who doesn't have a PhD in hydrology, to understand where to find and interpret all of the information about how stormwater is being managed on the site, and that interaction with stormwater and down gradient impacts. I would encourage EPA to consider having a comprehensive document available per the Emergency Community Right to Know Act, and general permit requirements of having those stormwater management plans on site for public review. It just really helps people understand whether things are happening in the correct way or not.
So we have a comment from a CAG member that says that there's a small piece of property along the east side of Gun Club that is not City of Aurora, but is Arapahoe County. What's to stop you from putting in a well there?
I don't know. They would have to, please show it on, we need to know exactly the property on a map where specifically they're talking about. Like, it would be much easier to answer that question.
All right, while I do that, Margie has a question, so if we could come back to it, I'd appreciate it. Hold on. Margie? Unmute.
Thank you. And I understood that last time I spoke, people were having trouble hearing me, so I just want to ask. And
much better, much better.
Great, thank you. I just want to make a few comments, and that is I've really appreciated the discussion tonight, but as a homeowner living in Murphy Creek, the area that we're pretty much talking about, I have to tell you that I've gotten no comfort from what I'm hearing. My interpretation of everything I've heard is there are no specific parameters to determine if there are compliance issues or not. And I'm not talking about for everything. I'm talking about there are some things where there are no specific parameters. So how do you know if you have a problem? And a lot of what's being fallen back on is, well, 20 years ago, we set up these requirements and these specifications, and that's what we're following. And nothing is stagnant. Nothing ever remains stagnant. There's always change. And I'm so grateful to the people who have been pushing for that in today's conversation. Is why don't we do another review and start looking at this site from today's environment and today's standards, and not something from 20 years ago, which, by the way, has been proven was unreliable information at the time. So every time I hear past 5-year reviews being referred to, that really bothers me, because we already know that some of those were not accurate. So thank you.
Okay, I downloaded the map that that Maggie sent. I'd like to share it with you now. Maggie, do you want to address the group?
Sure. There is a small piece of property, like I said, that is just along the east side of Gun Club Road, about where it bends and goes to towards the west. And for some reason, this is in unincorporated Arapahoe County. It is not part of the city of Aurora. And so my question is what stops somebody from drilling a well on that piece of property? Because it's not in the city of Aurora.
This is Commissioner Baker. I'd like to just maybe try and take an answer to that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Who owns the property? It's the owner of the property that would have to consent or agree to having a well drilled on their property. Many property owners require a land lease for things like this, and certain amount of payment in order to draw. But as far as I know, nobody's, I mean, it could be.
But what stops the owner from doing that? You know, we know in the city of Aurora what has to happen, but what happens
There's
in
no
Arapahoe County?
There's no prohibition from, as far as I know. Is Jan Yecke still on the call? As far as I know, there's no prohibition from anyone doing anything on their property unless it is, harmful, and unless it is something that, is specifically prohibited. But I don't know about any prohibition for drilling. You're talking about drilling a monitoring well, I'm assuming.
No, what if they wanted to put in a well for, if they put a small...
Oh, they'd have to get that permit approved by the state.
The state would permit it.
And they'd have to have the water
permit the water well, water for drinking purposes. Yeah, that would be CDPHE as far as I know.
No, that would actually be the, that would,
engineer.
sorry, that would be
the state engineer. They'd need to have a water right.
Yes, thank you, Steve. That would be the state engineer, and Steve is correct. That would be a water right. That's not a CDPHE issue.
Okay.
So yeah, any owner of a water right has the right to install a well to use their own water right, and they'd have to go through the state engineer's office to permit that well.
And this is Karen, and I did want to say that based on the size of that parcel, it looks to me like it's a right-of-way. And of course in Aurora, you can't put a well on right-of-way, and I'm just guessing, and maybe Jan can answer this, that that's not where you would put a well of any kind, unless it was a monitoring well and there was a lease agreement.
Yeah,
that was my thought, Karen, was that just glancing at this, I mean, I haven't tried to look up this property, but it does look like it might be right-of-way rather than a residential parcel. But again,
I think it's,
if it were a
residential,
I'm sorry.
I said I think it's commercial, and they've got like equipment stored on there right now.
So we would go through the same process that we would for residential if it were commercial, someplace that was outside of a water district. But they would have to get a permit from the state for a well that would support the commercial use of the property. Usually we see that with commercial agriculture. Say, for example, production greenhouses. Then they have to go to the state and get a well permit. But on a property that size and in that location, I would anticipate that we would be looking for someone to get water service as opposed to having a well on the property. But ultimately, that's a state decision.
Well, this is Tom Butts with Tri-County. I think the other part of that question is, does the property owner own the water rights under that ground, or have they transferred those to some other party? So again, the Department of Natural Resources that issues the well permit would adjudicate that issue.
Yeah, that's the basic. That's the most important thing, is the ownership of the water rights.
And I'll just say, if it's a property of interest, then if any of us get an application for anything in that area, we need to just bring it back to the CAG and let them know.
Agreed. And we do share that information back and forth between us and Aurora. And whenever we get any land development proposals, there's a process where we solicit feedback from the neighbors and everybody in the area as well.
And Tri-County is often a referral on those as well, and we certainly watch this area closely.
Thank you. Thank you, Maggie. And John Barber has a comment. I think that's about it. Where are we on time, Lisa, after John?
We're
Tim, hey, Tim, congratulations on your announcement. You'll love retirement, okay? Hey, I have a comment, just some thoughts, reflection more than anything. I was on a call with the, and I think some of the other CAG members were too, on a call with the folks out there at Buckley Airfield, or the Air Force Base, and talking about the plumes and the contaminants and all that they have. And for probably the first 45 minutes of the meeting, they went through a discussion about how big the plume was, what was in it, what they're doing about it, what their long-term plans are, their concerns for construction in and around the plume, and what they're going to do to negate those issues. And they were very clear in layman's terms. So at the end of that presentation, there really wasn't any questions, because they were very clear. I sat on this call and I listened month after month. There is no clarity. It seems like the CAG has to come and punch, constantly punch, asking questions. We have to direct the questions because they're not answered proactively. And it's frustrating, and I don't know why it seems to be like that, because it seems so unnecessary that we have circular conversations. And sometimes I feel like we're treated like we are naive, trying to go through a 45-minute presentation. What's the difference between surface water and groundwater? It's pretty easy to understand, and it seemed like a waste of time to me. And then it just goes into a circular conversation, and we really don't accomplish anything. We just end the thing, and well, okay, we'll talk about it next time. And so, I think I'm echoing some of what Margie was saying. It doesn't seem like we're making progress. I mean, 3 years we've been at this. I don't think we're any further along than we were 3 years ago. I don't know that it's declared safe. I don't know how big the plume is. I don't know what's in it. I don't know the monitoring wells. I don't know what's going on with the monitoring wells, because it's Molly. Oh, well, maybe it's Molly. Maybe we don't know where that came from. Oh, maybe we do know where it came from. Oh, wait a minute. It only was in one well. Well, what about those other wells? Well, we got to drill another well. And it just goes on and on and on, rather than a proactive posture from the responsible parties and those that are supposed to have oversight to come to the CAG and say, this is what we're doing and this is where we're going. Just doesn't seem to happen. It seems like we have the meeting, the CAG asks questions, they don't really get answered. This is a circular conversation, and on we go. So I'll end my comments with that. Thank you.
Lisa?
Well, I guess we can wrap up the meeting with just a plan to meet in October, unless anyone has any final comments or topics for the October meeting. Sorry.
Could be that we could review all the work that's been done over the past couple years. That'd be helpful.
This is Bonnie, and I'm wondering what work is ongoing right now that would be pertinent next month. I'm not sure. To me, we've been asking to talk about dads for a long time, and I think we'd like to move on to that because we have a lot of question about dads. And so could we ask for that meeting, what, 3 meetings ago? So I don't really, the rest of the CAG board has every right to say what they'd like to have done, but I really don't know that I want to sit and listen to what's been done for the past 2 years. I would really like to move on to a discussion about dads. We have so many issues there. Is there other opinions on that?
I have a question on that, Bonnie. So from the CDPHE standpoint, if we could get any questions that you would want us to address beforehand, we will need to touch base with the folks that work on dads. Dustin and I aren't involved with the oversight on dads, so that we can make sure those get answered. So if you could, anything that you're going to ask from the state side, if you could give that to us ahead of time and give us some time to research that information, we'd appreciate it.
Sure, no problem with that, Colleen. That makes sense. I think we gave a list to EPA a while back, but I can't really remember. So I'll go back and we'll see what we submitted. And you're right, you need to know what the questions are. And I understand exactly what you're saying about you're not solid waste. However, you and Dustin are very important to the discussion because our concerns are that Dad's section has never been clearly examined for what's happening with the chemicals through that area. And we think that it's a very important part of the equation where the chemicals are going and what's happening with them and everything. And we're just not clear why we've never seen a really good investigation there or why Superfund hasn't been brought into it, because a part of the Superfund site actually goes right into Dad's, that little nose that sticks out, that little triangle. And so, we've never seen a really good breakdown of how Dad's was or wasn't investigated. So I would be happy to do that. And I agree with you. Anybody that needs us to list those questions would be happy to.
Thank you.
Hey, Bonnie, I have a question about that. Does that include information about the sand lenses and why there's 1,4-dioxide in the landfill, the Aurora landfill down the way? And we've never really talked about what happens on the west side of the landfill and those sand lenses and why there's 1,4-dioxide. Yeah. That just always goes away.
Well, John, I think that's a good point. And I think we need to ask our questions about what happens on the west side. The reason that we don't talk much about it right now is because we're waiting for the city of Aurora to complete their study on Highway 30 landfill. Once that's completed, then I think we can have a meeting and, have more information given to us. But right now, we've got to wait till they finish their study for them to be ready to come and talk to us.
Thank you.
So I agree. We have to ask those questions because the west side's very important. And we also know there's also the issue that we need to be talking about too is, like we said, we've got to talk about, are we meeting the requirements of the ROD? And so I'm very curious on that as well about MW38 isn't being treated according to what the ROD requires. And I want to know that the new Molly site is going to be treated that way. So we also need to hear from the WSDs. I see they're digging a new trench out there, and I think it's for the new updated pipes or something. And I'd like to hear from the WSDs what's going on with that and what they plan on doing for treating that Molly at the site. So I think between Dad's and the Molly update and what's happening with the new line they're putting in out there, I think that's one whole meeting. And I agree with you, John. We need to talk about the west side of Dad's, because we've been wondering for a long time, is that a conduit for the chemicals to be moving in the groundwater to the north? So those are things that we can talk about. We'll put our questions together and send them to EPA and to the state. And I have to say for myself that Colleen and Dustin, we really appreciate it. Well, you didn't say much, Dustin, but hi. And we're glad you're here, and we enjoyed your conversation. And thank you for participating in the discussion. This is really good. And I hope that this new format has helped other people. And John, I agree with you. We go round and round, but we at least had a discussion tonight instead of us yelling at the WSDs or EPA and the EPA yelling back. We had a discussion tonight, and I learned a lot. And so I appreciate everybody's participation in this, and thank you for doing this, Lisa and Janine. I appreciate it. But I would say those are the two issues we need to discuss, and I think that we should put together the questions we're going to pose and where we'd like to go, and send this to EPA and CDPHE and plan for this next meeting. Is anybody else in agreement?
This is
I think that's, I'm sorry, I think that's a good idea, Bonnie. I don't want this to escape. I want to hear what Richard has put together, because the development is a big concern to me, and what's going on with that. So I want Richard to have some time set aside for next month.
Oh, that's great, Paula. I agree with you. And I asked him if he wanted to come out here and use my system to talk through, and he said, nope, I want my own. That's our Richard. Anyway, I agree. He needs some time at the next meeting to outline what he's done, because we're both very shocked that this is going on and that 0.9 is being allowed by water quality. So he can put together, we get 10 minutes. He can put together 10 minutes telling you what he has and bring copies of the emails he got from water quality. And he can give a good presentation next time. I think that's good, Paula.
And again, Bonnie, if you guys can tee that up ahead of time, so CDPHE can track down information from the Water Quality Division if need be, or you know, better understand, so that they can represent the agency on the call at the CAG meeting, that'd be great.
Absolutely, absolutely, be happy to do that.
This, Tom, I would like to expand that. If you're talking about DAS, let's remember that DAS is also to the east and the northeast of the site. And I would like to expand it to the areas where there is not containment at the Superfund site, which is MW38, and the two areas on the eastern side where contaminants are leaving the site and are not being tested for beyond that area. And we're going to ask, or at least I'm going to try to get it so that we ask EPA and the WSDs not to just tell us what's happened in the past. And we would need to do what John said and tell us what you're going to do about in the future. Give us your plans. How are you going to make sure that this is safe?
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I think I agree with Bonnie. It was a great discussion. And we'll try to stick with this format as best we can. And I know there will be times when, for example, the conceptual site model comes out not too far off, October, November, I believe. As discussed with Bonnie and Tom, we'll send that ahead for you to look at and evaluate and bring up your points. And you can send your questions to us before the CAG meeting as well, so that then we can start off like we did this time with discussion rather than presentation. So thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next time.
Have a great night. Be safe.
Good night.